tonight as we hold our annual Women's Equality Day event, this year celebrating 100 years of votes for women. The League is a nonprofit, nonpartisan volunteer organization. That means that we don't support or oppose any party or any candidate. Instead, we have a broad mission, and that is to help people understand the voting process, help them get registered to vote, provide nonpartisan information about candidates and issues, and convince them that their vote really does count and that then they actually go to the polls and vote. All of these things have become a lot more difficult during the COVID crisis. Still, voter education particularly is so critically important. So tonight we're very pleased to have a distinguished speaker who will remind us that although the passage of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution gave votes to women, the change did not guarantee that all women were able to vote. It took many additional years for people of color to be officially granted voting rights. And even now, there are many ways in which voters are disenfranchised and continue to face barriers to voting. Dee Pendleton, our speaker, is the president of the Tyler alumni chapter of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Delta Sigma Theta was founded in 1913 by 22 collegiate women at Howard University. Locally, Tyler Alumni Chapter was chartered in 1942 and has consistently participated in voter registration and voter education efforts since that time. In fact, the chapter was one of the League's Making Democracy Work Award recipients just last year. So we really appreciate their collaboration and their help. Dee joins us tonight to talk about the role of African-American women in the suffrage movement, something that in the past has received very little attention. Dee, and just as a side note, Dee and her colleague, Ruby Kendrick, who is one of our board members, gave a similar presentation to TJC students. That was pre-COVID, that was in February. We had 80 people there, most of them students, and they became very engaged. They were very excited to hear the actual truths that were presented and had very thoughtful comments. So we said at the time, we need to take this to a broader audience. And so tonight we're very pleased to have Dee presenting the information on African-American women in the women's suffrage movement. Dee?
Good evening, Marilyn. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to give an encore performance, an encore presentation on the contributions of the African-American suffragettes. I am Denise Pendleton. I am currently president of the Tyler Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. I am also a board member and volunteer coordinator at the Texas African American Museum and an advisory board member for the American Heart Association. I'm supposed to be retired, but I do currently work and volunteer part-time at the Tyler Literacy Council in student support. So that being said, I will try to share my screen. I know technical difficulties have impaired us a little bit tonight, but we're gonna go forward just like we're at home together, and we're just having a conversation about the contribution of these African-American women. So I'm gonna share my screen now. And are you able to see my screen? I'm going to assume that you can.
The top part of it's a little bit blackened out.
Okay, let me see if I can move some things around. I know it's probably dark at the bottom now. I'm trying to remove my toolbar. Is that better?
That looks pretty good.
All right. Let me see if I can go back instead of forward here. Oh, it wants to go forward. All right. Just been a day for technical difficulties, I tell you. All right, lifting as we climb, why we vote. So today we are here to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, to discuss the contributions of African-American women to the women's suffrage movement, and to discuss the reasons why we vote. So typically when you pull up a Google and you put in women's suffrage, you come up with some very iconic images. You see here the program of the Women's Suffrage March, which happened in Washington, D.C. in 1913. And you also see the picture of Inez Milholland on that white horse as she led the way through the parade. I also put some of the most famous names that you will see from time to time when you Google women's suffrage. What's missing, though, are the African-American suffragettes. I will say that in recent months leading up to this 100th anniversary, I've seen more information come out about the African-American suffragettes. Even since the Black History Month presentation that we did, there have been articles in the Washington Post, there have been articles in National Geographic and on the news. So this is very exciting that not only will my presentation bring some light, but there's a lot of information out there right now. So many Black suffragettes started out as abolitionists. Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frances Harper are just a few. And despite their efforts, Black women as a whole were often excluded from organizations and their activities. Black female reformers understood that in addition to their sex, their race significantly affected their rights and available opportunities. So I put in another Google just to see what would come up. And if you notice, there's a whole line of suffragettes, and they are white women suffragettes. And there's one African-American who is a male, and that is Frederick Douglass. And the reason why he's there is because when the women's suffragette movement started in 1848 in Seneca, New York, he was one of the keynote speakers. As a leading abolitionist, he was invited there to support the women. But basically what he said was, you don't need me as a man to put a stamp of approval. You got it. Women can do this themselves, and do this themselves they did. So when I show this particular slide, people usually cringe because most people just don't like history because it's a bunch of dates and a bunch of times and places, but you need to have a point of reference. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but I do want to give you what normally comes up when you see the women's suffrage movement. And that is in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first time that women got together to talk about these women's rights. During that time, they also signed the Declaration of Sentiments. And this was very similar to the Declaration of Independence, but it added females. It said that male and female deserve the rights of all citizens, and they deserve the right to pursue happiness, which included the right to vote. So starting in 1850 through about 1869, there were national women's rights conventions every year. But in 1961 through 1965, during the Civil War, a lot of the suffrage movement activities were put on hold, and that's understandable. But as soon as the war was over in 1866, you had the creation of the American Equal Rights Association. And this particular organization was interracial, and it included abolitionists and women's suffragists. So it was an all-inclusive organization to put forth that effort toward the suffrage movement. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified. Now, this amendment addressed citizenship. And for the very first time in the Constitution, it used the word male, M-A-L-E. And of course, this didn't sit too well with the suffragettes who were trying to get the right to vote. They were saying, are we not citizens as well? Just males are citizens? And you will see a lot of activity, which is not highlighted here, but a lot of activity where women would still go and try and vote, even though they technically didn't have the right to vote. And they used the 14th Amendment as the reason why they could, because they were citizens of the United States. So in 1869, the suffrage movement split. And what this split was about was the pending 15th Amendment that was coming up. And the 15th Amendment was giving the right to vote to Black males. And for some women, they couldn't see women not getting the right to vote first before Black males, specifically white women getting the right to vote before Black males. So there was a split between the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. And the National Women's Suffrage Association was spearheaded by Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And then the American Women's Suffrage Association was Lucy Stone and several other suffragettes, including some African-American suffragettes. So in 1870, I did put this information in. Victoria Woodhull runs for president, becoming the first woman to run for president in the United States. And I thought that was important to include in the women's suffrage movement, considering that we now have a woman running for vice president. There haven't been that many women who have run for president or vice president. And so I thought it was pertinent to put that information in, just so we can see where this started, all during this suffrage movement. In 1890, you have the NWSA and the AWSA, they merge, and they finally put their differences aside and become the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And so they go into the 1900s unified to fight against women's suffrage. The next highlight is 1913, which is the Women's Suffrage March, which was in Washington, D.C. It was purposely put the night before or during the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. And that was so that they could get the publicity and they could have everybody there and paying attention, and pay attention they did. I'll put a pin in that because that year is very important to my sorority. 1916, Woodrow Wilson endorses women's suffrage. 1917, the White House is picketed, and I put that in big letters because things are getting pretty deep right now, where people are getting arrested, they are being incarcerated, they are picketing, they are serious about getting the right to vote. And in 1920, I have that the 19th Amendment is ratified. So that's just an overview, a timeline of how things are going. So during our presentation in the spring or the late winter last year, we profiled 4 African-American suffragettes: Anna Cooper, Frances Harper, Mary Church Tyrell, and Ida B. Wells. Now, some of these names sound very familiar, and as you Google, you will see these names probably more than some of the others. But I wanted to spend just a little time with each one of them and talk about their contributions. So Anna Julian Cooper, she was a prominent African-American scholar and a strong supporter of suffrage through her teaching, writings, and speeches. She was born to a house slave, Hannah Stanley Haywood, in Raleigh, North Carolina. She studied on a scholarship and taught at St. Augustine's Normal School and Collegiate Institute in Raleigh. There she met her husband, George A.C. Cooper, whom she married, but he died a few years later. She attended Oberlin College, where she obtained her Bachelor of Arts and her Master of Arts. And actually, she and Mary Church Tyrell graduated together, becoming the first African-American women to graduate from college. She received her PhD at the age of 67. And she was an educator most of her life, instructing in Latin and mathematics. And she taught at Dunbar High School, which then was M Street High School, which was the first African-American high school in the United States. She was the author of A Voice from the South, and she's cited as the work of the first African-American feminist. It was published in 1892 and later by Oxford University Press. Now, we'll mention that Anna Julia Cooper is a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, which was founded in 1908 at Howard University, and it was the first African-American sorority in the United States. And I will say that my former presenter, Ruby Kendrick, whom Marilyn mentioned earlier on the board, is a member of that organization. Next, I will talk about Frances Harper. I'm skipping around a little bit. There's a lot of information about her, but what I wanted to highlight was that in 1866, she spoke at the National Women's Rights Convention in New York. Her famous speech was entitled, "We Are All Bound Up Together." And here she urged her fellow attendees to include African-American women in their fight for suffrage. She emphasized that Black women were facing the double burden of racism and sexism at the same time. Therefore, the fight for women's suffrage should and must include suffrage for African Americans. Now, the very next day, the convention held a meeting to organize the American Equal Rights Association to work for suffrage for both African Americans and women. That particular organization was comprised of abolitionists and suffragettes, and it was Blacks and whites. Now, it says this organization soon split up over the decision to support the 15th Amendment, which I mentioned before. This granted African-American men the right to vote. And Harper, along with Frederick Douglass and many others, supported the amendment. So they joined Lucy Stone in forming the American Women's Suffrage Association. Mary Church Tyrell. Her activism was sparked in 1892 when an old friend, Thomas Moss, was lynched in Memphis by whites because his business competed with theirs. Tyrell joined Ida B. Wells Barnett in anti-lynching campaigns, but Tyrell's life work focused on the notion of racial uplift and the belief that Blacks would help end racial discrimination by advancing themselves and other members of the race through education, work, and community activism. It was a strategy based on the power of equal opportunities to advance the race, and her belief that one succeeds, the whole race would be elevated. In her words, "Lifting as we climb" became the motto of the National Association of Colored Women, a group she helped founded in 1896. And she was president of this organization from 1896 to 1901. Now, I will interject here. If you notice the timelines, this is after the two white fractions of the suffragette movement merged. And even though they merged, they were still very exclusive of their African-American counterparts. So African Americans took it upon themselves to create their own organizations, and that they did. The National Association of Colored Women was one of the largest organizations in the United States for women, and the fact that they decided to collectively connect all of these different suffrage groups in the communities into a national organization gave them a lot of leverage with working toward suffrage efforts. Now, I mentioned her, segue right into Ida B. Wells, because Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Tyrell both knew Tom Moss. Tom Moss was the man who was lynched in Memphis. And this goes into a little bit more detail about how he had set up a grocery store and the business was doing so good that the white owner was upset about it. And so they had clashed on a few occasions. But one night, Moss and the others guarded their store against an attack and ended up shooting several of the white vandals. They were arrested and brought to jail, but they didn't have a chance to defend themselves because the lynch mob took them from their cells and murdered them. So Wells went on to write newspaper articles talking about the lynchings. She even took a tour through the South. And what she found out was that lynchings were not criminally motivated, that sometimes they were motivated because of discrimination and because of the political and economical threat that African Americans had as they came into their own throughout the Reconstruction period. So I thought that was very interesting. Now, she went on to move to Illinois, where she founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was the first suffrage club for African Americans in Illinois. And that was the club that she marched under in the March on Washington in 1913. So I put this slide in, which says on March 13, 1913, 22 founding members of Delta Sigma Theta sorority organization showed up at the Women's Suffrage March in Washington, D.C. This was actually on Oprah Winfrey's website. As I mentioned, a lot of groups are starting now to come out with the stories about African-American suffragettes, and they are including the history of Delta Sigma Theta in that. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was on a Zoom call with our national president, Beverly E. Smith, who talked about this very special occasion for African Americans and for Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. It is said that and a suffragette in the Washington, D.C. area went over to the campus of Howard University and was talking to the students. And Delta Sigma Theta, who had recently reorganized, they originally were members of Alpha Kappa Alpha, but they reorganized in January of 1913 under the name of Delta Sigma Theta because they were more concerned with issues like women's suffrage and political avenues. So they decided to march in the Women's Suffrage March. Now, they had to get a chaperone in order to go. And the night before, there was a rape. And so there was a lot of tension. I'm just trying to put myself in that situation and think as a college student, if I still would have gone to a march with all of the things that were going on, with all of the rumors of what might happen and all of the adversity that there was for women's suffrage. But they did go, and when they arrived, they found out that they had to march in the back, that it was going to be segregated, but that was okay because they were there. Now, Ida B. Wells is the only one that's kind of quoted as breaking ranks. As soon as the march started, she ran through and got with the Illinois delegates and marched under her own state's delegate. So I put on the next pages just some of the contributions of African-American suffragettes. So Sojourner Truth, Ain't I a Woman speech, she gave that in 1851 at the annual Women's Conference in Akron, Ohio. This was the second conference after the Seneca Falls Conference in 1848. Carlotta Lottie Rowland in 1869 spoke on the floor of the House of Representatives in South Carolina in favor of women's suffrage. Mary Shedd Carey, she was the first woman admitted to Howard's Law School, and she was denied graduation because the DC Legal Code did not allow women admission to the bar. Eventually, she graduated, but a decade later, and she became one of the country's first African-American women lawyers. Now, I thought this was interesting because we wonder what motivates people to get involved in these movements, and the fact that was just one example of how women were not allowed admission to the bar. And so she had to wait almost 10 years to get what was due her as a law student. Harriet Tubman, who we know as the great abolitionist, also served in the Civil War as a nurse, a cook, and a scout. But she had to fight for her pension for 34 years after the war. So again, another reason why women were very adamant about having the right to vote and making sure that they were not discriminated against because of gender or because of race. So how were they contributing? Through speeches and lectures, through newspapers, through papers and books, through organizations, and by their leadership. So I just listed a few of these. Again, Ain't I a Woman was a speech. Education and Elevation of the Colored Race was a speech that Frances Harper gave at one of the national conventions. The newspaper, the Provincial Freedman and the Women's Era were newspapers that were founded, edited, and published by African-American women. Papers and books, A Voice from the South, a book by Anna Julia Cooper, and poems on miscellaneous subjects which was written by Frances Harper, and she wrote that at the age of 20. And then there were organizations like the Alpha Suffrage Club, the NAACP, and the National Association of Colored Women were some of the organizations that were organized by the African American suffragettes. And then as far as leadership, they proved that they were able to be great organizers, and they proved that they were able to be great leaders and mentors. So you will see a lot of times the people that they mentored carrying on that torch, which is a really good thing considering that when the 19th Amendment was approved, it still didn't allow all Black women to enjoy the right to vote. Now, this is always a fun screen. There are several African Americans that have been highlighted on the postage stamp, and 5 of the suffragettes are on postage stamps: Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Anna Julia Cooper, and of course, Mary Church Tyrell. So after the 19th Amendment, there were still obstacles. Marilyn talked about some of the situations that are going on even now with voter suppression. We don't have to worry about Jim Crow laws or poll tax or literacy laws now, but at the time we did. I will share a story. My grandmother's baby sister passed away a couple of months ago. She was born in 1922, and so she lived a great life. Her daughter mentioned that being from Corsicana, Texas, she was not allowed to vote because of the poll tax. But when she moved to San Diego and later relocated to Providence, Rhode Island, she was afforded the right to vote. So I am moved sometime when people think that this was so long ago. 100 years is really not that long ago, and even shorter time since the Voters Act of 1965, which actually got rid of the Jim Crow laws and those things that suppressed African Americans from the vote. So I will conclude with one of my favorite slides: why vote? And I put "your vote matters" because I hear people all the time say things like, well, it doesn't matter if I vote or not. I'm just one person. And to that I say, you're not voting as one person, you're voting as part of a collective. You're voting with all of the people who agree with the policies and the candidates that you've chosen to support. So it's kind of like a weight and balance. The more people that vote on either side declare the winner. So your vote definitely matters. And to that end, your vote counts. A lot of elections are won by such a slim margin. I don't know how people can say my vote doesn't count. And then regardless of all of that, why vote? Because what would have happened if these women had not fought for the right to vote? Where would we as women be now? I mean, these women were voting, they were fighting for the right to vote, to own land. They were fighting for the rights for better jobs, jobs outside of the home. They were just fighting for the right to be equal. And I haven't even gotten into some of the other things as far as education and labor. They fought against domestic violence, all kinds of issues that affect women. And where would we be if they didn't have the courage to stand up and say, we deserve this right? And how in the world can we now not take advantage of that right and vote? So I'm hoping that by shedding a little bit of light on the African American suffragettes, and please know that there are other suffragettes that are yet to be discovered. During this research, I learned that the Native Americans were very influential to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton, because when they visited the Seneca Nation, they saw the power that women had and how they were at the table with making decisions for their communities. And that was part of their inspiration to go out and seek women's suffrage. So I'm waiting for that history to come out as well, and I'm sure there are plenty of others. But I don't know how anyone can take the right to vote lightly and how anyone cannot take advantage of the right to vote. So I'm hoping that everybody has looked at all of the conventions for the past couple of weeks, and that they are starting to look at their candidates, not only on a national level, but on a local level, and start to look at what aligns with what you want for your life, and then make your vote count. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys. It's a little difficult to talk to my screen and my stuffed animals, but I thank you for your attention, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions at any time if we get any in the future. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Dee.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate it. A lot of really interesting information in there and a lot of stuff that we just haven't heard before. I know that you said that there are a lot of people looking at this right now. It's much more popular than it was even a year ago, but still, and in Tyler, we know that there are Tyler people who participated too. So I just think it's such an important message, and tying it to the courage that those people had. Oh my gosh, I don't know if I would have really had the courage to do what they did. It was incredible. So I really thank you for bringing that message to us. So each year during our Women's Equality Day event, the League presents a Making Democracy Work Award. And it goes to either a person or an organization that does critical and important work in our community. It's our desire to every year recognize and honor those who truly make a difference in Smith County. Tonight, we're extremely proud to give that honor to someone many of you already know, and that's Nancy Crawford, Executive Director, soon to be retired, of the Literacy Council of Tyler. To tell you a little more about Nancy is one of our board members, Tammy Burnett. Tammy?
Thank you very much. I'm very honored tonight to be able to introduce Nancy Crawford. Dee, that was a wonderful presentation. And when we talk about women's equality and the right to vote, the foundations of that is really education, inspiration, and motivation. And I think that no other person that I know that could really exhibit all of those would be Nancy Crawford. Nancy is a native of Tyler and her husband Doug, and they've lived here all their lives. They've been married 43 years and have 2 daughters and 6 grandchildren. Nancy received her bachelor's degree in education at Stephen F. Austin. I didn't say what year, Nancy, I left that out. She taught elementary education at TISD, and she homeschooled her children for many, many years. Nancy began work in the adult education in 1990. She became a certified pro-literacy tutor, tutor trainer, supervisory trainer. She's also a graduate of the Leadership Foundation of Tyler and Tyler Leadership, or Leadership Tyler locally. Nancy is the past president of the Philanthropic Educational Organization, past president of the South Tyler Rotary. She's a former board member of the Tyler Chamber of Commerce. She is also the past president and current member of the Literacy Texas, past board member of the East Texas Workforce Commission, and past board member of the Commission of Adult Education. Nancy's been employed as the Literacy Council of Tyler since her inception in 1990. She's personally trained over 500 employees. Since 1996, she served as the executive director of the Literacy Council and has grown the budget from $150,000 to $1.7 million. The Literacy Council of Tyler enrolls about 2,000 adults annually, providing classes in basic literacy, GED preparation, and/or English as a second language. Nancy's favorite quote is by children's author Emily Bushwald: "Children learn to read on the laps of their parents." On a personal note, why I would like to introduce Nancy is that I'm a product of the Literacy Council of Tyler. I was one of those people that was a high school dropout, wanted an opportunity to better my my life for myself and my children. And it was through Nancy's inspiration and motivation that helped me to get my GED, helped me to get my associate's degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, and eventually my PhD. And when you talk about someone inspiring women and inspiring everyone in Smith County, it certainly is Nancy Crawford and the Literacy Council of Tyler. And she taught me to the importance of public service, of voting, and being a responsible citizen of Tyler. And I will always be grateful for her for that. So thank you, Nancy Crawford.
Nancy, would you like to say a couple of words? You're muted. Oh, there you go.
Got it. Wow.
Yeah.
So kind, Tammy. Let me first start off by saying that Dee actually works at the Literacy Council of Tyler. She doesn't report directly to me, so our paths only cross casually. But I'm sitting here wondering if the ones that she works closest with understand all your potential, Dee. I'm not sure if they do, and I think I might have to do something about that. So just thought I'd give you a heads up on that. I thought that was an excellent presentation. I learned a lot from it, and I'm very impressed with how you put that together and how you delivered it. Of course, I'm equally impressed and have been for some time by Tammy. She gives me a lot of credit and I appreciate it, but this has been a team effort from day one. I don't know if Tammy remembers this, but the first time I met her was at a Slotsky's when she was talking to our director of volunteers at that time. I was so inspired, and that was far before she had accomplished everything she has accomplished since. And so yeah, I love to watch people, and of course I'm a little partial to women. I love to watch them find themselves and realize what all they can do. Tammy certainly did not believe that she could be where she is today. I can tell you that I know that firsthand, and that's very typical of our students. I'm sure Dee has seen that. They come to us pretty defeated, and it's a fantastic opportunity to watch them get over that hump and go on to do great things. So thank you. I couldn't be more honored. I love this organization. I loved everything you said at the beginning, Marilyn, because as you described the league, it reminded me of all the reasons I joined. It is hard to find any information about voting that is nonpartisan. It's practically, well, it's just impossible. And that's the kind of information I want. I don't want all the spin. I just want the facts. And I always check the league before I go into, I have for many years before I go into the voting booth. So I'll be glad to answer any questions or whatever. I'm sure you're all about ready to wrap this up, but thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Well, thank you, Nancy. And
Yes.
it's definitely our pleasure to give this honor to you this evening. And thank you, Tammy, for a really nice introduction. I thought that was very personal. So before we go, let me give everybody a heads up about what is coming up with the league, because we have a presentation and we'll get our Facebook Live fixed before this, but Tuesday, September 29th, you're going to want to be sure to be participating, because we're going to hold a forum on the Electoral College. And you know that that's terribly relevant and important given the looming November election that we have. To give you an idea of who our speakers are going to be, Dr. Karen O'Connor. She's a distinguished professor and director of Women in Politics Institute at American University. She's studied the backgrounds of electors in the Electoral College. She's the author of multiple books, including Women, Politics, and American Society, and Women in Congress, Running, Winning, and Ruling. In addition to her, we have Dr. Geronimo Cortina. He's an associate professor at the University of Houston, and he's the associate director of the Center for Mexican American Studies. He's one of the authors of one of the few political science books that became widely read, Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State. He's also the co-host of Party Politics Podcast, which is on Houston's public radio station. So that's going to be an enormously important and relevant and informational forum. So we really hope that you'll join us. As many of you know, National Voter Registration Day is coming up September 22nd. It's going to be really challenging this year. A lot of our deputy voter registrars are not willing to go out in the community because of COVID. And so we're looking for young people who are willing and healthy and want to mask up and do all the right things, but get out there and help people understand the process. So if you have any interest in doing that, you can send us a message through Facebook or on our website. We'd love to get you involved in that. Another way that you could become involved is through becoming a poll worker. Because of the extended number of days of the election, because of a lot of the poll workers not wanting to work during COVID, there's a real need for extra people to step up, and that could be one way you could really help your community, is by becoming a poll worker. And in October, we have another really extremely relevant subject. We're putting this one together. We don't have a date firmed up yet, but it's going to be on mental health during COVID crisis, because so many people, not just the COVID crisis, but all the ramifications of the COVID crisis are really impacting people's mental health. And so we're going to talk about that specific to Smith County. What resources are there? Where can you go to get help? So we hope that you'll join us in October, and watch Facebook and our website for the dates and times for that. Again, our Women's Equality Day event is normally a pretty big deal, and we have silent auction, and we sell tickets, and it's a fundraiser. So let me just put this out there. If you believe in what the League is trying to do, and you have the ability to make a contribution, please go to our website and do so, or better yet, become a member of the League, because we really need people to be out there encouraging others to understand how to vote, that it's important, and they need to be part of the process. So we welcome you to join us in that endeavor. So thank you, Dee, for presenting tonight. It was very wonderful. Thank you, Nancy, for all that you do for the community. And I thank you all for joining us tonight, even though it wasn't in exactly the format that we wanted. I hope we can get the information out to you. Thank you and good night.